Hello and welcome to the ThreeWill podcast. This is your host, Danny Ryan, and I have Tommy Ryan here with me. How's it going, Tommy?
It's going well, Mr. Ryan.
Ooh, we're going to be formal today, huh? Let me see how formal your socks are. You've been going with the stripes lately, huh?
Yes, yeah.
Nice. I can look at these. A little flare on mine.
Wow.
Yeah, a little fluorescent action.
Not sure what to say about those.
I know. It sort of goes with the fluorescent green shirt here, too, huh? All right. Next subject. What I wanted to talk to you about today is using offshore resources and just sort of the evolution of how we've been using them.
We use them?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, don't you get the emails? It's $18 an hour. I mean, why wouldn't you use offshore resources, right? Now you probably are like me where you get people calling you out of the blue, and I'm sure our clients get the same thing as well, which is, hey, look at this. You can for $18 an hour, you can have a SharePoint expert not at your door, but at least on the line with you. And what I wanted to do was just sort of talk through the evolution of where we've started using them on projects. We can mention the one partner that we've had the best luck with. I think it'd be interesting to sort of give the backstory on that. And then also talk about what are some of the pros and cons of doing this. What types of projects do we see work out best for using offshore resources? Just sort of have a general conversation about this. And I guess to get us kicked off, maybe give me a little bit of the backstory on when did we start using offshore resources? Sort of how did this evolve over time?
Sure. It's interesting how it did start. We had one of our customers have a previous relationship with an offshore team. And as we were looking at a project with them, they wanted us to combine our team with their team to go after a project. And so we did that, had an open mind to that and tried it out. You definitely get a lot of people talking about how hard it is, how many challenges that you might have in that scenario using an offshore team. So we, approached it with our Scrum methodology. We had some dedicated time to making sure that it was successful, and it was. We were very pleasantly surprised to see how well that went the first time. So it kind of teased us into saying we should consider that in the future and think about when that would make sense.
Excellent. And so this was a specific organization. I'll use their name, Trigent, which we, it's funny because I do our, our AdWords and all that stuff, and they spend a lot in the areas that we spend on. So there's some
interesting.
Yeah. So I run into some of their advertising when I'm doing research, but so we were introduced to them through a client, and then we started using them more on projects. Or where did it go from there, where we had the first experience?
Well, and I don't know the exact projects, but what we ended up doing is there are certain projects that you get to a financial number that it starts making sense from a standpoint of being competitive. And when you're competing, sometimes we're competing against larger firms that have their own offshore team.
Yeah.
And so the pricing becomes different than what we normally see when we're in, say, something south of 100,000. So you get north of 100, or really north of 250, 500,000 for a project. There's almost the expectation that you have that offshore component, just optically, where you see, okay, we're not paying all U.S. full rates for this project. You have a blended team that helps it look more economical. When I go up to my senior management to get approval, and I'm comparing different proposals, and if we don't have a proposal that does have offshore, sometimes it can knock us out of the running to win an engagement.
So as the projects get larger, just the expectation is you'll have some some higher cost, very specialized consulting resources, and then some of the project work will just naturally be things that you can use a lower cost resource on.
Yeah, especially if you get into things that can be set up like a factory, where it's a repetitive thing and you want to go through a cycle and repeat, and you're trying to crank things out. Migrations is a great example of that.
I was going to ask about that. Since we're doing more migrations, are we starting to use more offshore resources because of that?
It depends. If it's got to be something fairly large. We've also found ways to use some of our testing resources as a way to blend the rate. But if it is a multiple months, let's say 3 or more months of migration work, then it starts making sense to get that team up to speed, because there is a ramp up for that. Finding the right team members. You don't always get the perfect team in the beginning, and you might need to do some adjustments. So you want to figure that out, and you need to have time to figure that out. And then after you get that all dialed in, you can start really getting some benefit from that ramp up and start seeing some economies of scale.
So do we end up like interviewing them for seeing who goes on the project, who doesn't go on the project?
Right. Yeah, we do. And one of the benefits of going back to the same partner each time is some of those folks we already know from previous projects.
Yep.
And then, of course, there's definitely turnover in those organizations that you're going to see new faces. And so we end up interviewing those and then kind of seeing how things go. And if there is some challenges, we'll make adjustments. And that's key, I think, to have a good partnership for an offshore, resources. You need to be able to roll with the punches, because, from customer to customer, there might be someone that's a good fit for customer A, and then that same resource is not a good fit for customer B. And there's times that these resources are directly working with our clients, where we're not kind of putting them behind the scenes and no one sees them. There's some direct interaction. So there needs to be certain skills, and those skills are not just communication, but approach to the problem and how do you address triaging an issue, because some of that support and migration is to go after that, say, level 1 of triage. Mm-hmm. And sometimes there's resources that are better at development than the triage, and so you have to figure that out and respond to that.
So what does it look like? Do all of our clients allow us to use offshore resources, or how do we sort of introduce the concept of using outsource?
Yeah, I mean, we're introduce it. One, it has to be in that range of costs that says it's worth slowing down a bit to be able to have an integrated team. So it gets to a certain dollar figure, let's say, then we start saying, let's entertain that. And then the customer, depending on the customer, they might not have the ability to use offshore resources, depending on the type of data we're moving and what their sensitivity is to having offshore resources. So we'll figure that out with the customer. It's something that we don't, quote, force upon our customers. It's more of, is this a benefit to you? And we're willing to manage that and bring that into the equation if it makes sense to the customer and it's going to be of value to the customer. So after we kind of figure out it's large enough to do it, it's the type of project that will fit with an offshore team, and the customer is happy with that, then we propose different options. And usually if we get to that step of proposing an offshore team versus just a pure ThreeWill team, they're opt for that offshore because we can show some benefits economically. Maybe it takes a little bit longer, but in those bigger projects, being 4 months versus 5 months, sometimes that's fine.
This is brought up. I think I'll probably cover this with Eric or someone else who's been involved in some of these projects, but just some tips for managing offshore resources. But I know in general that there's probably some since we're managing them, which is nice that we're doing that for the client, there's got to also has to be a little bit of overhead as well, where some of our time is spent towards tasking out and just checking up on as you're doing code reviews or pulling things back in, that it's not that you're just assigning tasks, they're doing them, and there's no oversight of that as well.
Yeah, so when we do have an offshore component, most of the time, if not all the time, we work with a lead that will kind of QA some of the work, give assistance to the developers. And we're trying to use some of the same leads over and over again that know how to, give the quality that we're looking for, how to, communicate appropriately when it does come to client-facing activities. And so we have a, quote, management component over on the offshore team side. And then we've learned over time that we have to have our project management component on the ThreeWill side. At the end of the day, we can, as much as we can say to a client, well, if you want to work with them directly, that's fine. Go ahead. You can manage that relationship. We don't have to be in the middle, so you don't have that extra cost. And when we do that, what happens is something goes sideways. It's not being managed by the client, or they're just not used to, how do they take a left and right turn with certain situations. And that becomes really our problem.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, we're looked at as the company accountable to that because we've introduced them as, the offshore team. So we've learned that as much as a client wants to manage the offshore resources directly, we end up saying, let's not do that because we want to have a good, positive relationship. So if we can't afford having the ThreeWill project manager involved, then let's not add that to the team. Or you can go directly to an offshore team, and that way, you can, we're not kind of caught in the middle and don't have any ability to manage it to be successful, because we want the customer to have a positive experience.
Yep. That's great. What else has been any sort of tips that you've sort of picked up as from working with? Because I think the couple of folks from Trigen, I wasn't here in the office, but they dropped by. Was it earlier this year?
Yeah, it was probably a month and a half ago.
Okay. Any tips for sort of choosing, and I know this one is just sort of we entered into a relationship because of a client, but any sort of through the years, any sort of tips that you have for people when working with offshore teams or companies?
Well, our approach was to stick with the same company. And stick through that company through thick and thin. And there might be, challenging situations, and you're making an investment in that relationship. So I would advise not hopping around and saving a couple dollars here and there by hopping to the next offshore team that sends you an email. When you pick that first one,
don't encourage them, because they send us emails too.
Right. And when you pick that first one, maybe it's not the right one, and you got to pick another one. But after you kind of get through a few success stories together, see it through when you have some tough times, because there's going to be some situations where things do go sideways and you have to work through it, and see how that company works through the tough times with you. And that's where you're going to see, is it worth kind of keeping that relationship going? So I think, staying consistent is important. Having a project lead on their side, a kind of a dev lead on their side is important. Having a project management or a team lead management on your side is important, I think, to give quality and a positive experience to the customer. And try to find ways to make a factory, where you can come up with, processes in tooling that can be repeated over and over again, because that's where you're going to get a lot of velocity and value out of that project, is if you're not trying to go after something new every sprint, but you have some repetitive things that need to get done sprint after sprint. I think that's the way to get the highest value out of the arrangement.
And you're mentioning sprints, so these are they're on, and this may be appropriate for talking through with Eric, but they're on the daily stand up, and they've got their capacity and what they're burning down and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and I don't think it's perfect, but I think there is the daily stand up. I know that happens on the projects I've seen recently. Mm-hmm. So you have to pick an early time to kind of have that overlap. So you see sometimes 8 o'clock or 7:30 type stand ups. Mm-hmm. And then, having them participate on the backlog. I think we're constantly working on making that better. It's not as good as a local team member, but that also kind of speaks to work with the same team, because you're training people on how we get work done together as a team, and you don't want to have to start from scratch every project, but kind of build upon something.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been great. I mean, I think it's been interesting to see how this evolves, which is really, I think, the size of the projects drives a lot of whether we start to introduce offshore components to this. Some of the projects we do, where it is underneath 100K, having a fast-moving team and really you can't get any of the economies of scale or anything. You basically are trying to deliver something within a very short period of time. Has often been pure, all ThreeWill folks. But I know as we go after larger and larger projects, this has been a nice option for us and for our clients.
Yep, it has.
Great,
surely has.
Great. Anything else before we wrap this up?
I think that's good.
Awesome. Thank you for taking the time to do this, Tommy, and thank you everybody for listening. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.